Welcome to the Saturday Cadence podcast. I'm Blake Biscardi, and remember, the Saturday Cadence podcast is the heartbeat of college football. We are back in game week. We have got week 0 on tap on Saturday. That means college football in its best form is back on the field. We've got games ready. But before we get there, we're going to do a Big Ten preview. Welcome into Saturday Cadence. My name is Blake Biscardi alongside Grant Kincaid. Got a great show for you today. We're going to actually start batting leadoff with Friday's ruling from the NCAA on Michigan. Then we're going to talk about Ohio State's quarterback news. Julian Sayin has officially been named the starter. This is what we expected. We hinted about it on the show being named today on Monday. And then we're going to get into our conference championship predictions for the Big Ten, and we'll talk about all the top teams. So, Grant, let's hop into the show here. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what Michigan's punishment was from the sign-stealing investigation from the NCAA. It's going to begin with a fine of approximately $20 million. That could reach about 30. That's all going to be tied to postseason revenue. And when you're looking at this punishment, Grant, it was really the largest financial punishment ever handed out by the NCAA. But in terms of immediate impacts on the field, not really going to see much there in terms of a postseason ban or vacated wins looking back, anything like that. The program is, though, on 4 years of probation. There's a 3-game suspension for Sharon Moore. 2 of that is already from the self-imposed from Michigan for the 3rd and 4th games of the season. And then the NCAA saw it fit to add 1 game next year in the 2nd of his show cause. So he will be suspended for the opener in 2026. Jim Harbaugh received a 10-year show cause that will begin after his current 4-year show cause from another case. Connor Stalions received an 8-year show cause penalty, and then Denard Robinson a 3-year show cause. And again, there were no vacating of wins. There was not a postseason ban for Michigan. So, Grant, what is your immediate reaction to this? Is this more of a slap on the wrist to you? Do you think the hammer came down? We heard about this proverbial hammer for months from certain accounts on Twitter. Nobody really knew, but what is your reaction to this punishment quickly from Michigan?
Well, it's like you said, it's the largest financial fine they've slapped on a team yet. The NCAA has. So, we'll see how that trickles down maybe and affects Michigan in the future. But, other than that, it feels like a bit of a slap to the wrist, and it feels like something that if you are a program where you have people in place where you could run operations like that or take chances, maybe you start doing that because you just saw Michigan win a national title and basically get like you said, the proverbial slap on the wrist. And it's a lot of money, but it's also an enormous fan base with a lot of money. So, in the NIL era, this punishment of the 20 plus $1 million fine may not mean as much as it used to. So it seems like, if anything, the NCAA should have done more. Um, but it is what it is at this point. It's been droning on for a while. It's just it's odd that there's been so many people at fault for this, and it's just kind of been a bunch of little dick and dunk penalties. But I'm glad it's probably over at this point.
Yeah, one thing I want to note real quick from the NCAA's findings was one of the quotes direct from the case said Harbaugh ran a program that was largely dismissive of rules compliance. There was little, if any, emphasis on following the rules. To the contrary, his program saw compliance as the enemy, made their own decisions regarding interpreting the rules to their benefit, or outright committed rules violations. And then in this case, it does say a postseason ban is required. However, the panel determines that a postseason ban would unfairly penalize student athletes for the actions and coaches and staff who are no longer associated with the Michigan football program. Thus, a more appropriate penalty is an offsetting financial penalty. So basically what is being said here is that they were guilty. They know it. They have the evidence. We heard about Connor Stalions throwing his phone in a pond and all the other various things that happened, deleted text messages and whatnot. I know that's a slightly different part of the case there, still involving Sharon Moore. But Grant, looking at all that stuff, they just decided the financial penalty was it because the NCAA's days are over where they can, throw around their weight to a major program. They don't have the weight they once did to throw around. We saw this with Ohio State. We saw this with Tennessee, USC taking away Reggie Bush's Heisman. Those days are gone for the NCAA, and they know it. So basically, the only thing they could do is try to hit them where it hurts, and that's their pocket. But like you said, Michigan's endowment's enormous. The fan base is large. They can find that money, as a drop in the bucket for them. So this is behind us now. It's all moving forward. We know that they did it. So if you want to look at it and say, hey, that national championship has an asterisk, you can. We saw the game. We saw the memory. We can't erase it. That's pretty much where it stands right now. It's all right. We know they did it. And then you kind of just take your opinion and attach it to that national championship from there. But Grant, today, Ryan Day named Julian Sayin as the starting quarterback for Ohio State. Officially, he beats out Lincoln Kienholz. What's your reaction to that from Ryan Day? Is this what you expected? I know we tabbed him as the presumed starter. How do you see this working out for the Buckeyes? We know he's the better thrower of the football of the two guys. He has a great arm. We saw his high school tape there. Kienholz is tabbed as the better athlete. He's a better threat with his legs. He's got more size on him. He was an Iron Buckeye. So Julian Sayin, though, wins this battle. He's got Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Brandon Inniss, and a host of other weapons to work with. So I think Julian Sayin is going to be in good hands here as the Buckeyes plan to host Texas here in just a couple of days.
Yeah, I think it was definitely the expected news. It's Ryan Day always does this regardless of who's in the proverbial QB battle that he likes to set forth. We had this even when Justin Fields transferred over, to be the obvious starter. There was always, Ryan Day keeping things under wraps, even though everyone knows who the starter is going to be. But we saw today Devin Brown even got beat out at Cal. So, if Lincoln was kind of in that same bunch, and we've seen him, we saw him against Mizzou, and he hasn't been able to really do anything since. It's pretty clear that Julian Sayin was going to be the guy, and I'm glad, now we can just, have that decision done and move on to this Texas game soon. That's going to be, a spectacle.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. It's a top three matchup. It's highly anticipated, probably the most highly anticipated season opener in college football history. And just to make things even more spicy, it's a rematch of last year's college football playoff semifinal in the Cotton Bowl. You've got Arch Manning opposite Julian Sayin, now Ryan Day, Steve Sarkisian, two of the brightest offensive minds in the sport and best coaches in the sport as well. So lots to deal with here and to unpack. Two really good defenses, teams replacing talent, but as we know, the stables are always full in Columbus and in Austin. So, Grant, let's hop into the Big Ten a little bit here, and we'll start with Ohio State since we're on the subject. When you look at the Buckeyes this year and their outlook, we see big games against Texas and in Penn State are at home. Then there's big road games against Washington and against Michigan. They've got Illinois on the schedule. So when you see Ohio State, what's your outlook for the Buckeyes? What are your areas to watch? We know they have the two best players in the sport, one on offense and one on defense, Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. So when you look at the Buckeyes, what is an area to watch and what's your outlook for them?
Uh, an area to watch as far as the schedule, I would say is, obviously you have that game at home against Penn State, but you have a game in Madison against Wisconsin the week before, and then the week after you go to Purdue. The Spoilermakers, perfect spot, a spot where you're emotionally let down after a game against Penn State, who is a national championship favorite and as of now ranked higher than Ohio State. So, physically, mentally, emotionally, it's going to be a team that's probably pretty battered, regardless of the outcome of that game. And they're going to have to go playing Purdue and, never know what's going to happen there. I guess that's mid-season as well. So it's a little stretch that I would maybe look at. Illinois, who knows? Number 12 preseason ranking, obviously, there's enough talent coming back on that team to be competitive in the Big Ten on the top end. But it's not a game where I'm going to be worried until Illinois really shows me otherwise.
Yeah, I think too. I agree with that, with Illinois not being so much of a concern for me. And especially if they're a ranked team that's going to have your attention. Really, the game for me, we know about Texas, we know about Penn State, and we know Michigan, the game. It's the biggest one on the schedule, regardless. I think that game against Washington, it's on the road. It's at the end of September, so Julian Sayin will have a month's worth of starts underneath his belt. But that's a tough place to play. That's going to be his first taste of a raucous road environment. And there's a very underrated home field advantage there for Washington. That stadium in Seattle gets really, really loud. I know it's made some of the top 10 lists of loudest stadiums here recently. So that's a game too, I think you got to watch for Ohio State. We know about those big showdowns against the ranked teams. We know about the rivalry games, but I think that game at Washington, your first true road test there, you're playing Texas week 1, and then you're going to get a breather against Grambling and against Ohio. Then you got to go across the country, across the time zones. You're going to most likely have a local kick at about 4 o'clock. So it'll end up being the proverbial primetime game there. So I think that's the spot to watch on Ohio State's schedule to be like, all right, again, that maybe doesn't have your attention that should. And that's going to be the spot there. But for Ohio State, I think too, whether or not they beat Texas, that's not going to affect that conference record. I think it's going to come down to those games against Illinois, and it's going to come down to Penn State, and it's going to come down to Michigan, and see how that works, because we know the tiebreakers, they don't play Oregon. So, Grant, let's say Penn State plays both Ohio State and Oregon, and let's say they split. So Penn State beats Oregon, and then Ohio State beats Penn State, but Ohio State doesn't play Oregon. Who goes to the Big Ten championship game? You're running off of those things. So, Grant, as you're looking at these top teams in the Big Ten, I think we can separate the big three at the top. Then you're going to have this middle pack and what teams play into that. So, this top three teams is going to be Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. Penn State starting the season ranked number 2, Ohio State right behind at number 3. So, those teams are in the immediate national championship contention, but they don't all play each other in the regular season. Penn State plays both. Ohio State and Oregon do not play. So let's say we're sitting in this scenario where Penn State beats Oregon, Ohio State beats Penn State, but Ohio State and Oregon don't play to complete that triangle. We could get into this situation where, okay, there's a tiebreaker to get to Indianapolis, and who wins that, right? But how do you differentiate these teams at the top? Do you think as a whole, when you're looking at this, between coaching staff, and let's include head coach as its own category too, and then roster talent, how do you rank those three teams coming into the season? Does Ohio State still have the best coaching staff and the best roster in the conference? Or do you think Penn State does this year, as James Franklin has brought in Jim Knowles and he retains Andy Kotelnicki and has that veteran team that Ohio State and Michigan have had in recent years? How do you break down those three rosters comparatively?
Yeah, I think Penn State's roster, pound for pound, may be even with Ohio State. I don't think that's in any way a wild thing to say. And obviously, they have Knowles, like you said, in the DC position right now, and we can't knock the guy. He just won a title at Ohio State. No matter what you want to say about what happened midseason with the coaching staff and changes and whatnot in the defense. Penn State is a force to be reckoned with. I think I still think that Penn State is last in the head coach department until proven otherwise. Obviously, this year is a big opportunity for James Franklin to prove that he should move up that list. Um, and I think Oregon, like you said, they're sitting there at number 7. They're right outside of that, that upper echelon top 4 or 5 teams. But it's Oregon and it's Dan Lanning, and it's always a scrappy team that's going to find their way into contention, and we'll see how that goes. As a whole, obviously Ohio State, I think they have the best opportunity between the coaching staff, the roster, and the way the schedule is set up for them. But I think Penn State is very, very close behind, if not even in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that's going to play out, obviously, in the shoe here, in a couple months.
So, Grant, let's talk about Penn State here. And I know Oregon and Dan Lanning are flying under the radar just a little bit because of everything that Penn State has retained. That retention's been the big story. Ohio State's defending national champions, but Oregon's sitting over there. They're a young team. They have a lot of roster turnover, but they have tons of talent. So we'll get to them in a minute. Penn State, though, are we really looking at national championship or bust for the Nittany Lions? Is that what James Franklin is facing this year? You're seeing that tabbed somewhere across the country. Some tabloids, some pundits are saying this. Like they're putting that tag on this season for Penn State. Do you really think that it is national championship or bust, given what they return, the coaching staff addition that they have with Jim Knowles, everyone coming back? James Franklin's finally got to get over the hump at some point in time. Do you really think that this is national championship or bust for Penn State, or do you just think it's okay, we've got to beat Ohio State and go from there?
Uh, I think they have to be play in the national championship or bust in a lot of ways. Whether or not that happens, that has to be the mentality for a Penn State is not just making a Final Four. We have to play in the game. We have to give ourselves a shot at winning the title. So I would say with especially with going all in with Jim Knowles and the way the roster has kind of been built up, it is kind of that year for them. And I think the preseason ranking is something that gives that even more of a weight to James Franklin, which not something that he needs, more pressure. But I do think it's pretty much championship game or bust.
Now, do you think James Franklin and Penn State can handle those expectations, given his track record in those highly rated matchups in the matchup games? They beat the teams they're supposed to. James Franklin has been a great coach at Penn State. I think he is a perfectly rated head coach for Penn State. It's just going to be the fact, can he strike lightning and can he beat Ohio State? Or, Grant, maybe he can't beat Ohio State. They'll still going to make the playoff because I think they're going to beat Oregon. And even if they don't, 10-2 Penn State is still in the playoff if they don't win either of those matchup games on the schedule. And they can catch fire just like Ohio State did last year. I mean, what's to say that they can't do that? And all right, they win a national championship, but they don't beat Ohio State once, or they don't beat Oregon, but they can beat the SEC teams, or they beat Clemson. So, how do you deem this season successful for Penn State? Do you think it's the mile marker of beating Ohio State or actually winning the championship? I know you're saying they need to at least play in the championship game, but just to unpack it a little bit further, what makes this a successful season for Penn State?
Yeah, I think that is it. It's they have the opportunity to, take advantage of the playoff system, like Ohio State did last year. And I think people mention, the playoff is made for Penn State to make it just because of how their program has been ran for so long. They would make it and they would make a mid to high seed, almost every year if there was a playoff expanded like we've had now. So, I think, James Franklin is gonna wear that system out. He's gonna give himself the best opportunity every year and be all in with this new NIL era. Penn State has upped the ante with a lot of that East Coast money that Philly, and not that they're right next to there, but you know, there's something going on at Penn State where they're becoming a monster. And I think even if they lose to Ohio State, it's that one game that he can't win. He can't beat Ohio State. Ryan Day is facing that with Michigan. And who's to say that James Franklin couldn't repeat the same formula, especially with the same defensive coordinator. A lot of similarities in the way he's doing it, and props to him and the program for saying let's try this out with a Drew Aller, a prospect that we believe in, and he's shown that he has a lot of talent, and he's shown that he can compete at the highest level. So it's good. I'm really that game against Ohio State is going to be, monumental in so many ways.
Grant, I give Penn State, I break their season down into three opportunities. I think two of them are going to be against Ohio State, and I think the third one's going to be in the playoff. I do think that Penn State beats Oregon, but that Penn State Oregon game, that's not something to me where I say, okay, Penn State's a national championship contender just because they can beat Oregon. What I want to see is Penn State beat those perennial Big Ten powers that they've had trouble beating. They've had trouble beating Ohio State. They've lost their last 8 to the Buckeyes. They've struggled against Michigan on this since they've been on this run. Can they beat the Buckeyes? So I think they get two shots. They're going to get one, obviously, because the game's first on the schedule. That's guaranteed. I think they're going to get a second opportunity in Indianapolis in the Big Ten championship game. And then I think in the playoff, regardless of the outcome of that Ohio State game, either time, they still are going to get a chance in the playoff to go on a run. And I think that's the third opportunity of how you define the James Franklin tenure. I think it's how you're going to define Penn State as a football program. What do they do with those three opportunities? We broke it down last year for Ohio State. They have three goals: beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, win the national championship. And there was a lot of talk for years that, okay, I'd rather beat Michigan than win a national championship. Okay, well, Grant, we've seen years where we beat Michigan and not won a national championship, and Ohio State does that. But then you're sitting there last year, you don't beat Michigan, you don't win the Big Ten, but you win the national championship. And I don't think anybody in Buckeye Nation was sitting there on the night of January 20th saying, oh, you know what? I'll put this confetti back in the cannon if I could just go beat Michigan. And I don't say that to belittle the game. I'm just saying if you have three goals, what do you do with those opportunities? The Buckeyes got another opportunity and they made the most of it. So for Penn State, I think that's how this season is going to define the future for them, because you said they are trying to become into a monster. They have gone all in on NIL. They're doing renovations to the stadium. They've given James Franklin the money to spend with the coaching staff, bringing in Jim Knowles for a really high price tag, Andy Kotelnicki. They have the infrastructure now to take that next step. And then they have the roster now to do that. So the stars have aligned in State College for Penn State as a program to take it to the next level. And what will they do with those three opportunities this season? And that's what I think is going to define Penn State moving forward for recruiting, for how seriously they're taken on the national stage, because it is kind of an if not now, then when for Penn State being all in that way. So that's how I evaluate the Nittany Lions going into this season. So, Grant, as we look at a team like Oregon, Dan Lanning has recruited at a really high level. We know the cupboards are stocked in Eugene. They've got talent across the board. I think Dante Moore is going to be a dynamic quarterback, but when you look at the team like Oregon with all the roster attrition that they've had, this team's going to look very, very different at the end of the season. I think early on, it's going to take them a little while to get going. And we even saw this last year because of how much Oregon uses the transfer portal, but they have recruited really well. So now you're going to start to see that start to marry a little bit better, because there's a ton of young talent in there. This team's going to be really good by the end of the season and as well next year in 2026. So looking at the Ducks, I do think they lose to Penn State early, but Grant, this team could get in the playoff and just catch fire and go win a national championship. Like they have that kind of upside. I don't know if they do it, but that could happen. That potential energy is there. So when you're evaluating Dan Lanning's program, how do you see that right now heading into this 2025 season?
Oh yeah, it is a team that there's a lot of turnover. It's a lot like the past few years where they're kind of, throwing the best transfer they can find at QB, and Dan Lanning finds a way to, make his defense an elite defense, or at least good enough to, reverse Oregon tradition and have solid defense year in and year out. And it is a team that's primed to make a run if they can put it all together. That being said, it's tough to do that year in and year out. Maybe, he's got a little more of the Calipari, if you will, strategy where he's just year to year finding the best talent he can and, putting it all together, and whatever happens, happens. And I think for Oregon, that's something that can work out, especially, um, you know, this year, you Dante Moore, who's someone who's been unproven, bounced around a little bit. Um, so it is something that I think would have to take place later in the season. Obviously, they don't have to play Ohio State in the regular season, which will aid them. Not to say they won't have other tough games, but it's going to be an interesting year for Oregon. Definitely a lot of unknown.
Yeah, and even looking at Oregon's schedule too, they've got the Civil War game against Oregon State, but the big game really is at Penn State. Maybe Indiana's going to be a tough game. I don't think so. At Kinnick, I think playing Iowa will be interesting. Seeing the Ducks go there, how they handle that environment. Maybe it's a night game, maybe it's a Friday night game, a blackout. Who knows? We'll see what that experience is like. But that could be potentially tricky, especially if Iowa has figured out the forward pass. That is what some camp intel is, you know, spreading around the Twitterverse. But we'll see if that actually happens not in 7-on-7 form. And then they've got a game against USC. I think will be tricky because USC could be good at Washington, though. I know I said this for Ohio State. I'm going to say that for Oregon, Washington. If I had to pick a team that had big games on their schedule that could pull an upset, I think it's the Huskies. I think they'll get one of Oregon or Ohio State, and the more likely option there is Oregon. So I think this is a two-loss team, and for those reasons, I think that's why they missed the Big Ten championship game. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Grant, are there any teams in this conference you think could be dark horse playoff contenders, maybe even push for a spot in Indianapolis, or do you think someone off the radar is going to get to Indianapolis and face one of the big three teams that we talked about?
I think this year in the Big Ten specifically, it's going to be really tough for a dark horse to make it in, namely because of the teams we talked about so much at the beginning, Ohio State and Penn State. The Big Ten is very top heavy with those two teams, and both of those teams are teams that can suffocate, basically any other team in the Big Ten, with the exception of the possibility of a team like Oregon or Michigan putting it together, better than we thought. So, I think as far as a dark horse goes, I wouldn't count on it.
Grant, how about in terms of making a playoff push? Do you see a team like USC or Nebraska, Michigan, perhaps making a run that could be an at-large team in the college football playoff?
Definitely Michigan or Oregon are huge candidates for that. They're kind of on the outside looking in, as of now in my eyes, you know, kind of like what Penn State usually would be, kind of that team right on the outside of the upper echelon of the Big Ten or on the fringe that, most of the year kind of drops out with their couple of losses throughout the year. Um, Illinois does have, the advantage this year of starting number 12 in the country. We've seen teams like Indiana last year. If they can put together a season where they beat enough teams and they start high enough in the rankings, they could put themselves in the position to play in a playoff game. Obviously, we know what happened to Indiana in the playoff last year. But there's a lot of things that could happen now that couldn't before, and Illinois making the playoff is, a very real possibility.
One of the things you look at when picking a dark horse is do the stars align with your schedule? And I think for Illinois, you're seeing at Indiana and then home against USC, Ohio State, at Washington. That seems to be a theme here with all these highly ranked Big Ten teams, and then at Wisconsin. So that schedule for Illinois, if they have the team they think they do, and could it be the same team that we saw last year? It just might be that might be their ceiling, but I know they're a popular pick. If they can beat USC and Washington and then lose to just Ohio State, or maybe lose one of those other games but beat Ohio State, certainly beating Ohio State, they're the highest ranked team on the schedule. That would give them an inside track if they're a one or even two loss team from the Big Ten with a win over the Buckeyes. So Illinois, yeah, popular pick there, but I do think that Nebraska's schedule is the most favorable of these teams. I think Michigan has a shot to go to the playoff. It's just going to depend on how they fare in that game against Oklahoma. Similarly, Nebraska, if they want a shot, they've got Michigan at home. How does how do you fare in that game? Can you find a way to win that football game? And if they do, then I think that's where they can say, all right, 10-2 really is in our sights. We could do this. And see where the chips fall, because I do think there's going to be a cluster of three-loss SEC teams at the end. There's going to be opportunities if a team from the Big Ten finishes 10-2, not named Ohio State, Penn State, or Oregon, to find their way into the college football playoff as a low at large team. But Grant, let's not delay the inevitable here. I know I've hinted at mine. You've not tipped your hand, so you've done a better job than I have. Which two teams get to the conference championship game in Indianapolis to play for a Big Ten title?
I do think it's going to be Ohio State and Penn State. It just seems like these are two teams that have set themselves apart in a lot of phases from the rest of the pack in the Big Ten this year. And even with, if either team stumbles here and there, I think there's a good chance they make it in, um, which makes for two, very monumental games between Ohio State, Penn State potentially this year. And like you said, it's going to give James Franklin an opportunity to get the monkey off his back. Even if it's just one of those games, it would be enough, I think, to propel Penn State into a run in the postseason.
Grant, do you have the Buckeyes? How do you see those games turning out? Basically, you have the Buckeyes winning both, winning one, Penn State winning both. What are your thoughts there?
I think Penn State, it's would lose that game in the shoe, and I think in a neutral site, with the momentum that Penn State would have at that point, that would be their shot to beat Ohio State, and I think it would be, a pretty good likelihood, based on, them having two shots at it, and obviously the neutral site being a huge factor in that as well. Beyond that into the playoff, who knows what could happen at that point. These are teams that are so even. If they did clash in the playoff, it would be a really tough one to call, honestly, this year specifically.
Grant, I see you've been taking PR lessons from some local politicians here with that answer. I respect that because I'm with you. I think that these two teams could very well split. I think the likelihood of that actually is probably more likely than not. I just don't know if I can get myself to pick it until I see it. That's the thing for me with Penn State. I just don't think I can pick it until I see it. So I'll take the Buckeyes to win both of those. I have the same matchup as well. Sorry for those of you listening, thinking you may get a different outcome here or a different game matchup. We both feel pretty strongly that these will be the two teams, either the two best teams in the conference in our judgment. And I will pick Ohio State to win the Big Ten championship this year. Ryan Day rights the ship there. So that is our Big Ten preview. Grant, any closing thoughts here as we wind down the show? Talking about the Big Ten, lots of storylines in this conference this year, whether it's Bryce Underwood at Michigan, Julian Sayin at Ohio State, the attacking national champions, Penn State's title or bust. Can Lincoln Riley get back into the national prominence in the college football playoff conversations? Can Dan Lanning get into the playoff and make a run? Are they a year away? Matt Rule in Nebraska. Everywhere you look in the Big Ten, there's a story, and we're going to have you covered all year long. But as we wind down the show, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to be, another year of, hopefully parity overall in college football. Obviously, in the Big Ten, we have these two teams, Ohio State and Penn State, that um, have loaded themselves up to the point where it's hard to see other teams competing. But that being said, this is college football. This is Penn State. Even though I've given them a lot of credit, this is Penn State and this is James Franklin. Um, we don't know what's going to unfold. We don't know who's going to come out of the woodwork and maybe make a run, like we said, the Illinois, the Nebraska, or maybe another team. And that's what, in the back of our minds, that's what we love about college football. And I think, that's something to think about with this conference.
It absolutely is. I think this is going to be an outstanding race for the conference championship game. I think there's going to be a lot of great matchups the entire season, some even that are not on the radar that are going to be great. And we have Ohio State starting the year with Texas. I know that's not a conference game, but my goodness, is that going to come into play come playoff time when it comes to national relevance and conference supremacy and all of that? It's Big Ten versus SEC. These are the two premier conferences in the sport. So that game's going to go a long way. But Grant, great episode today. We thank everyone for listening. This has been our Big Ten preview. And stay tuned for more coverage this week. We're going to have another episode here looking at week 0. We're going to have college football playoff brackets and more. Everything as we rev up our engines for the season. It is here just hours away now before college football officially kicks off for the 2025 season. Again, we think it's going to be great, and we've got you covered wall to wall all season long. So for Grant Kincaid, I am Blake Biscardi. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. God bless.